I moved into a new apartment about a month ago, and I've been seeing some strange things happening from day one. So let's start with the first day. This was after the movers had left, and I had begun to organize the place, starting with the kitchen. For a second there, my back was against the dining area while wiping clean of the kitchen cabinets. When I turned around to go wash the rag, I swear to God, I saw a man walking through the dining area and into the hallway leading to the bedroom. That startled me real bad, but I quickly chased after him while I shouted, "Hey, what the heck are you doing in my apartment?" I walked through the hallway, then opened the door to the bedroom, fully expecting the crazy man to be there, but no one was there. On the day that it happened, I thought the apartment must be haunted. What convinced me otherwise is the fact that the man I saw could never see me. The next few times that I saw him, I tried to scream at him, but he didn't react. In another instance, I was right next to him and even tried to grab him, but nothing. He just passes through like it's air, and he can't see anything that I do or say to him. I managed to record 3 instances and showed it to my brother. This is what he had to say about it. "Bro, you need a hobby or a girlfriend. Is this what you do in your free time?" I explained to him that I was serious, but he kept insisting that I was trying to fool him. He praised Adobe, the video editing tool, before leaving, by the way. After a couple of weeks, we're talking about last Saturday, my brother finally saw the man in real time. He bought pizza and brought it over to my place. While we were eating it, the man made a sudden appearance and my brother nearly choked himself from the shock. That was the first time that I was able to confirm that I wasn't just seeing things. My brother wanted to leave the apartment right away, even though I explained to him that the man was harmless. Now that I think about it, I think he probably soiled himself. I'm kidding about the poop, but he really was in a shock from that incident. Anyway, we went to a Starbucks to continue the conversation there. My brother told me to move out after the 6 months lease was up. He told me not to say a word to anyone else. He also said, "Bro, it doesn't matter what's true. What matters is what you can prove. If you take your videos around and show them to people, all they'll tell you is that you've done a great job at special effects and editing. That's if you're lucky. Dude, you don't think our government has special places for people who see things they shouldn't? People who disturb the finely crafted status quo tend to disappear and are never heard from again. Trust me, man, erase the videos, shut your mouth, run up the lease, and once you move out, forget that it ever happened." As moronic as my brother sounds most of the times, that's only when he's with me because we're brothers. In actuality, he works for the government, and is not a low-ranking official who works as a clerk at a town hall. He's pretty high up there. I'll just leave it at that. Initially, I thought about calling universities and perhaps science publications to see if they might be interested in studying the anomaly, but after talking to my brother, I've come to a conclusion that I don't want to end up in a special place reserved for the troublemakers. This will be the last time I talk about it, and I'll forget everything afterwards. I was walking with my girlfriend to the shopping mall the other day, and for a brief moment there, I saw an enormous explosion going off in the distance. The vision lasted for only a few seconds, but it looked so real that I nearly fell on my butt. I could have brushed it off as just a weird happening, but as it turned out, my girlfriend, along with everyone else on the street, has seen it as well. I knew that was the case as soon as it happened because I heard people screaming and some others had hit the floor as though they were preparing for an imminent impact. When the explosion disappeared, everyone stayed still, shocked and dumbfounded. One moment, we were certain that a nuke had gone off, but just moments later, everything had gone back to being normal. This was witnessed by at least 24 people. After a minute or two, some people left the premises quickly, but some stayed and they discussed of the happening with others who saw the same thing. Me and my girlfriend, we just laughed and went straight to the shopping mall. But I gotta say, The shock didn't really fade away until an hour or two later. It's been a week since the incident, but my girlfriend is still yet to come out of the shock fully. I don't blame her, it's not like I don't think about it either. I just try to suppress it to the best that I can, but seeing an explosion that should have wiped off the whole city and more, that stays with you no matter how much you try to forget it. I don't know what really happened on that day, but I too am still very scared. The year was 2002, and it had been 2 months since I graduated college. I had 2 job interviews lined up for the day, one at 11 a.m. and another at 3 p.m. I went to the first one and didn't really have high hopes for it. It was a small design firm, and the interview was conducted by the owner herself. I didn't think she liked me at all. On to the second interview I was, and so I ended up in this really fancy looking building in the city. It was a much bigger firm, and thus I was definitely not going to be interviewed by the CEO. That much was certain. I was put in a clean and elegant looking room when I arrived there. The whole process of going in, signing in, and talking to the correct people went smoothly. Everything in the company seemed to work like a clockwork, a far cry from the first job interview. Not longer than 3 minutes of wait, a gentleman came in and introduced himself as my interviewee. Let's pretend his name was John Smith. Well, John came in for a second, but then he had to leave right away when a woman came in and informed him that it was needed somewhere. He told me that he'd be back in a minute before leaving. A few minutes later, the door opens, but this time it's someone else. He says to me, "Okay, I apologize for that. Let's start again. I'm John Smith. Nice to meet you, Mr. Chambers." I wish I could go back and see my face in that exact moment, because I'm sure I had a real dumb look on my face and my mouth was probably half open. The reason being, he wasn't the initial John Smith. The first John Smith was a man of a small stature and blonde hair. The John Smith that walked in was at least 6'3", and he was a ginger. Face-wise, I couldn't really tell you for sure because initially I saw the first John for only a few seconds, but they looked very similar. I'll just leave it at that. Anyhow, the interview proceeds and the conversation felt very positive. I felt good about my chances of getting the job, but at the same token, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being pranked for whatever reason. Some 20 minutes later, my job interview ended, John and I shook hands, then I proceeded to leave the building. Fast forward a month, and I had begun working at the company. I mean the second interview company where John Smith works at. This is what I found out after a month of working there. The small stature John Smith with the blonde hair does not exist. At least not within the company. No one with that name and description worked there in recent years. As for the tall and ginger John Smith, well, I ended up working for him. He's not the CEO of the company, but he does hold the position of a director. He's worked at the company from the very beginning when the company was found. This John Smith is definitely a real person, and I worked with him Monday through Friday for 5 years. While I was working there, I half expected him to tease me one day about the little prank he pulled on me when I had my interview with him. But that interaction never came to fruition. I was never pranked, but I assure you, I did see the other John Smith, if only for a few seconds. I can also assure you that the 2 Johns I saw that day, they were definitely 2 different people. They might have similar faces, but you cannot mistake one from the other. The small and blonde John never showed up in the 5 years that I worked there. The whole thing is a big mystery to me till this day. What a way to start a career, huh? This story is from way back when I was only 19 years old. At the time, I still lived with my parents and I desperately felt the need for my own space. I had a job, but it didn't pay much. I just wasn't making enough money to have a place of my own. Hence, my temporary solution to the problem was to go on long hikes every weekend. It's not that I didn't love my parents or that they were bad parents. It's the opposite. I loved them dearly and they were and still are wonderful parents. It's merely something that comes to you naturally as you age, the need for independence. That said, I went on a hike one Saturday, and the plan was to be out there for at least 8 hours. I first began hiking 1 hour, then that increased to 2, and eventually as I got fitter, I could hike all day and still feel pretty fresh when I come home. The time was about 4 in the afternoon and I had hiked for about 6 hours by then. I wasn't all that tired, but my feet hurt a lot on that day. It was a problem with the shoes. I had purchased a new pair of boots and didn't have the foresight to break them in before the long hike. Only a fool would go on a long hike in a pair of new boots. But yeah, it was 4 p.m., my feet were hurting, but that was the least of my problems. The thing is, I had actually gotten myself lost in the woods. I think I got a little too confident having hiked at that location multiple times. I got a little carried away and hiked a little too far into the woods. It was nearly pitch black by 7 p.m. and I was quite scared by then. I never told my parents the areas where I normally hike at. Not to mention, I often slept over at my buddies on Saturday nights. If I got lost out there, my parents would have no reason to worry and therefore no reason to call for help. By 8 p.m., I was aimlessly walking through the woods until something promising finally showed up. It was a cabin. I walked toward it, and when I was at a close distance, I announced myself in case someone was already in there. After several hellos, no one answered, so I proceeded to walk to the door, then tried opening it, and it opened even smoother than my own bedroom door. I fully expected the cabin to be a home to someone due to the impeccable condition of the door. But when I went inside, I didn't find any signs of recent use. So I made myself at home. I ate a little bit of the emergency provision I take with me on my hikes. I also made fire in the fireplace, melted some snow, then I drank a little and also topped off my canteen. After that, I slept like a baby and woke up the next morning. After a quick breakfast, I thought to myself, that was actually not bad. I had a good night's sleep and for the first time in my life, it felt as though I had my own place. Yeah, I really enjoyed this cabin, and then I left. I walked for about 3 hours and I couldn't find anything that hinted nearby civilization. I continued walking for another hour, then another and another until nighttime had come again. I was lost again and I had no means to go back to the cabin either. I remember thinking how much I wanted to be back in that cozy and warm cabin. Then, not long after that, like magic, the cabin was only a few meters in front of me. As much as I was glad, it all seemed impossible how I could have gone back to that exact location. Think about it. I had walked something like 10 hours that day. In all the immense space out there, what are the chances of me ending up in the same location where I started my day? 1 in a million? A billion? I don't know, but the odds have to be slim, no? And yet, there I was, right back at the cabin. It's not like I had any other choices, so I made fire, ate tiny dinner, melted some more snow, then went to sleep. Come next morning, I tried finding the main trail again and failed again. Come nighttime, the thought of wanting to be back at the cabin had returned. Then, not long after, the cabin magically showed up again. The same thing repeated for the next 4 days, and by that point, all I could think about was being back at home, in my own bedroom, sleeping on my own bed, and having dinner with my parents. On the morning of the 5th day, I really wanted to cry as my head was filled with the thoughts of home and my parents. I just wanted to go home. Then after 6 hours of walk, I had finally found the first sign of civilization. I had found the main trail. I arrived at home at 6 in the evening. As soon as I entered the house, Mom burst into tears and she hugged me like I was a little child again. This could have been a happier ending if not for the fact that there was a discrepancy in the passage of time between me and the rest of the world. If you remember, I told you that I was lost for 5 days. I managed to find my way back home on the 5th day of being lost out there. Having said that, in actuality, in the world outside of the forest, I had gone missing for a full month. Now, one could say that I was mistaken, that perhaps the shock and desperation of being lost out there made me remember things differently. But if that's so, then how do you explain me surviving on those tiny rationed meals? No matter how small portions I might have rationed my meals, there's no way that I could survive for 30 days on the emergency rations alone. Aside from that, what about my beard? I take after my father and I grow some thick set of beards. Yeah, even at 19, I looked more manly than most men twice my age. When I came home, my beard was at just about the length I would have grown in 5 days. There was no explaining that. Anyway, I didn't make it a big issue because, for one, I was just too happy to be back home. And also, what good would it have done arguing about the length of time that I was lost with the authorities and my parents? Nothing really. As for the cabin, I've got theories on some aspects of its functions. I think it only appears to those who desperately seek solitude. I also think it won't let you go until you genuinely seek companionship again. It's just a theory. As for the discrepancy in the passage of time, I've got no answers for that. There's no doubt in my mind that it'll forever remain a mystery. I'm not much of an outdoor person. I don't enjoy sports, I hate driving, and I'm definitely not fond of camping or hiking. That being said, I said yes to go on a hike the other day because there's this guy that I like at work and he asked me if I wanted to go hiking with him. I lied to him that I actually love the outdoors. A few days later, I was hiking in some forest pretending to love the activity. We walked for about half an hour and I was already tired. I tried my best to make it seem like I was totally fine, but my date told me that we should turn back and go to a coffee shop or something to drink something hot. I think it caught on to my BS, so we turned around. We were maybe 5 minutes out from the parking lot, and that's when everything went dark around me. When I say dark, I don't mean it in a way that I couldn't see anything. It was weird because I could see my hands and body just fine, but everything around me was all black. Not to mention, my date had disappeared as well. I looked in every direction, but all I could see was that I was walking on a hard black surface. When I looked up, it was just more darkness. I was basically in the middle of nothingness. And there was nowhere to go since everywhere looked the same. I tried walking in a straight line for about 5 minutes, and without any warning, I was suddenly blinded by a bright light and I let out a scream. I covered my eyes and stayed still. That's when I heard someone running towards me, and then I heard the voice say, "Are you okay? What happened to you? Can you look at me?" So this is what happened from the point of view of my date. He tells me that I disappeared right in front of his eyes. We were walking and talking, but he was looking at me the whole time, and so he had a clear view of me vanishing into thin air. He searched for me in the nearby area, and I was nowhere to be found. Roughly about 10 minutes later, he heard my scream and came running to find me in the parking lot. He drove me home after that, and that date ended up becoming our first and last. What happened to me was too difficult to explain. Or maybe I should say that it was impossible to explain. There was no point in us discussing about the happening, and we sort of felt awkward to be around each other. Needless to say, I never went hiking again, and I probably never will for as long as I'm alive. I was late to work the other day, and so I opted to take a taxi that morning. I went outside and saw that I had a competition. There was another man down the road trying to catch a taxi as well, and so I was likely going to be the second in line. I walked down the road where the other man was standing. I sort of stood behind him so he would be the first one to grab the taxi. Moments later, lucky for both of us, 2 taxis had arrived at the same time. I waited for the man to choose one of the taxis. It was funny looking at him because he physically moved from side to side trying to decide. It took a second, but he eventually took the taxi in front, and I took the one right behind it. Both taxis started moving almost at the same time, but mine had to stop at the light while the first taxi was able to make the light in the nick of time. I sat there looking and thinking how lucky the other guy was. Here I was late for work and stuck at a traffic light, and bam! A truck had rammed against the taxi up front. Both me and the driver were in a state of shock. The collision was extremely violent, and the taxi? Wow, the taxi! It looked as though it had been crushed by a giant hammer. My taxi began to move not long after, and I remember keeping my eyes on the other taxi until I could no longer see it. That morning, life and death of 2 men had been decided by a roll of dice. The other man could have easily chosen the second taxi, and I could have been the one crushed by that truck. Literal chills run down my spine when I think of that morning. I don't think about it on most days, but I get reminded of it every now and then. One thing that I gained from that experience is a newfound appreciation for life. I do feel bad for the other guy, but let's not kid ourselves. I would not trade places with him for anything. I feel lucky. I am lucky, and I'm very thankful for that. The year was 2005, and the day this story takes place was my 23rd birthday. My friends and I went bowling, then to a restaurant, and wrapped up the night at a nightclub. I was able to hang out with 2 very close friends who had moved to distant places, and I hadn't seen in several years. It was likely the best birthday party I ever had. We left the club at 3 in the morning, and I was drunk out of my mind by then. We all had to say our goodbyes right there and then since the 2 friends had to leave the next morning, and they were all planning to stay at their parents' for the night. After the goodbyes, I was trying to grab a taxi but didn't see any in the 5 minutes I waited for one. So I walked a little to get the alcohol out of my system, and I also hoped that a taxi might come by while doing so. It worked out because a taxi had stopped at a red light. It would have just left me if the light was green, so I lucked out right there. I opened the rear passenger door and hopped on. Inside, I gave the driver my destination, but he wouldn't say anything back to acknowledge my request. It wasn't a big deal. I've dealt with worse drivers in the past, and it was never a problem. Anyway, soon after, I just passed out because I was so drunk. I don't know after how long, but I was woken up by the sound of the rear windows being smashed to pieces. Then I heard someone say, "Put your hands up right now." To tell you the truth, I have no idea how I reacted initially. I mean, half my brain cells have been fried from the massive amount of alcohol consumption from the previous night, and I had just woken up from a drunken stupor. I was not in the right frame of mind. Anyhow, I must not have reacted quickly enough, seeing as how I was dragged out of the taxi and then pinned on the ground like a ragdoll. It took me a good minute or 2, but I had finally figured out what was happening to me. I was being arrested by the police. You may think that I was scared, and to a degree I was. But you have no idea how relieved I was once I realized what was happening to me. Imagine for a second if those who had pulled me out of the taxi were not the police. If they were so, we're talking about robbery or abduction. The point is, if they were not the police, then it was bad news, real bad news. I got arrested without knowing why and was taken to the police station after that. Not long after, the interrogation began. I'll skip the details and get straight to the point. What happened was that I took a taxi that had been stolen. And it wasn't stolen by some nobody. The guy who was driving was actually a member of an infamous gang. The man had committed so many crimes in his life that one could write a short book with his official criminal records alone. The police told me I would never understand how lucky I was to be alive. Some of the things the man had done in his life, they told me there were acts of violence you'd only see in horror films. They didn't fill in the details of the crimes, but regardless, it was clear that I was extremely lucky to still be breathing. I'm not complaining, but I still don't understand why he let me live. Was he in a hurry? Did he not want to get his hands dirty on that particular night? Who knows, but that experience, yeah, that was the closest thing to death I experienced so far in my life. I got laid off from a job for the first time in my life when I was 27 years old. It was the only job I knew since finishing college, and I had never been let go of before, even when I worked part-time in college. I never knew, but it was the most painful thing I had to endure up to that point in my life. One night in 2008, this was a couple of days after being let go of. I was drinking alone at a pub because I was so depressed. My friend was supposed to join me, but she called me sometime later and let me know she couldn't make it. Something had come up. I had a couple of pints of beer and thankfully, no one bothered me that night. That is, until a man sat down at a table across mine and he began staring at me. At first, I pretended that I didn't care. After a while, however, he continued to look at me, and so I gave him a nasty look, which, by the way, didn't faze him at all. He stared at me continuously for like 20 minutes. I knew by that point that I had to leave the pub, but I didn't know how. It was already close to midnight, and obviously, there weren't many people out on the street. If the creepy dude followed me outside, it was likely that there would be no one to help me or call the police for me. I thought of my options, but didn't have much. I grew up in a city some 6 hours away from my residence of then. Thus, my parents were some 6 hours away, and all but one friend were 6 hours drive too far from me. The only friend close by was the friend who stood me up on that night. I sat there for another 10 minutes, feeling scared and depressed at the same time. But then I heard a laugh, a really happy and loud laugh from a table of 3 young men. They were there when I first stepped into the pub, and they were still there having fun. I told myself that I was going to take a chance with the 3 strangers who seemed to be decent guys. I went up to their table and asked them if I could sit with them. They were somewhat surprised, but I think they could tell that I was scared of something. So they told me to pull up a chair and to have a drink with them. I sat there and began telling them of my predicament. One of the guys suggested to a friend that they could give me a lift. But then another friend scolded him and told him that they too were only strangers to me, that I'd be just as scared riding with 3 men whom I didn't know. In the end, we came to a consensus to grab a taxi for me and also to see me off in case the creepy dude would follow me outside. With that decided, one of the friends went outside to grab a taxi for me, and the other 2 stayed with me at the pub. About 10 minutes later, the friend who went out for the taxi came back and gestured for us to come outside. Right before leaving the table, I saw the creepy dude one last time. He was still staring, and you could tell he wasn't happy about me leaving with the guys. In any event, I went outside and the taxi was waiting for me right in front of the pub. Before leaving, I gave all 3 friends a big hug and thanked them from the bottom of my heart. I went home safely that night thanks to the thoughtfulness of the 3 complete strangers. Thinking about them still gets my eyes watery, but with a big smile on my face. Things could have gone very differently if not for those 3 friends being in that pub and at that exact time purely by chance. The whole thing started with that creepy man, but I'm glad that most people in this world are decent. My experience is a proof of that. I own a small cabin that I often visit on the weekends. I live and work in the city now, but I grew up in a rural area and I still prefer the peaceful quietness of small towns. One Saturday, I packed up some provisions and tools, then left to the cabin early morning. There were some repairs I had to make to the roof of the cabin. Believe it or not, I find working with my hands both relaxing and therapeutic. I find that it keeps me sharp and the end result brings me satisfaction. I wouldn't spend my weekend any other way. I parked my car on the outskirts of the forest, since the rest of the way to the cabin one has to travel on foot. It's no big deal, we're talking about 10 minutes of walk through a picturesque forest. It's actually one of the reasons why I bought the old cabin. It keeps me slightly more isolated from the roads and people in general. 5 minutes into the walk, I came across a bear cub that had been killed by something. I say something because I didn't see any wounds on it. There were no bite marks, no scratch wounds. I mean, the cub could have gotten up at any moment and I wouldn't have been surprised. By first look, it was a total mystery how it had been killed. I knelt right next to the cub and began inspecting its body. Upon inspection, a couple of questions had been answered, but one new question had popped up. What I got from the inspection was that it was a recent kill, and that its spine had been shattered. What I didn't understand is what could have done such damage. The first thing that comes to mind is another bear. But if that were the case, the cub's fur and skin should have been ripped off in massive chunks. An adult bear can do some incredible damage with their front paws alone. That is to say, with their giant claws, they always leave their mark. The cub's carcass left me a bit apprehensive, but I had things to do and it was time to leave. I moved the carcass away from the trail and continued walking towards my cabin. Upon arriving at the cabin, I came across another carnage. This time, I saw the carcasses of another cub and that of an adult female bear. The adult female bear is probably the mother of both the cubs found by the trail and the one by the cabin. That answered who the mama bear was, but it left me with even more questions. Just what creature did this to the three bears? All three bears had their spines snapped off like twigs, and none of them had any scratch or bite wounds. Bears do eat other bears more often than you think. They are, after all, opportunistic animals. That said, it's mostly adult bears eating cubs, and it's not a rare occurrence. So, as you can see, there are many questions to be asked in this instance. We have three bears that have been killed under mysterious circumstances. None of them have been eaten, and all of them without superficial wounds. There's no figuring this out. I don't know any animal that can kill an adult bear so cleanly. I mean, how big and strong does it have to be to hold the bear still, then snap its neck like it was twisting a bottle cap? Again, as far as I'm concerned, there's no animal of such power and size. That day, I left the cabin not long after discovering the dead bears. If there was something out there that could kill an adult bear, then me as a human was akin to a seal next to a great white shark. There was no way that I was sticking around. I sold the cabin to a local businessman a couple of months thereafter. I told him why I was selling it and warned him about it too, but he didn't seem all too concerned about it. He told me in passing that city folks get scared of leaves falling. I don't think he believed me, even after seeing the now decomposed carcasses. I'm still yet to figure out what creature could have killed those three bears. If I were to speak openly, I would say that it was the doing of a creature that we don't know of yet. Something that's been forgotten in time, but is still out there and still killing. This was in 2002 and I was in my early 40s. 6 months prior, I had a divorce and it had taken 4 months to reach the settlement. So basically, it was around the time when I was finally free to do whatever I wanted. My ex and I didn't have kids, and I retired in my late 30s. At the time, I could literally do whatever I wanted. The first thing I did was to purchase a new place of residence. I wanted to live somewhere safe and quiet, but it had to be close to the city. After much research and consideration, I decided I was moving into a gated community. I gotta say, the neighborhood was really nice. All 85 houses in town were in immaculate conditions, and the community features were so well looked after. It also came with many amenities such as swimming pools, tennis courts, a bowling alley, golf courses, a gym, to list a few. So, on the surface level, it looked like the perfect place to live. I didn't get to meet anyone on the first day of the move. I saw some people walking and driving by, but didn't really get a chance to say hi to anyone. The next day, however, I began knocking on my neighbors' doors to say hi and to introduce myself. The family across the street were, how do I put this gently? Well, they were weirdos. When I knocked on their door, the husband came out and I put on a big smile for the douchebag. And what a douchebag he was, he refused to shake my hand and responded to every word I spoke with okay. And that was it. That was the full interaction. The second house I visited wasn't much different. I didn't see a single smile and the guy reluctantly shook my hand. By the way, he too only knew how to use two words. Yes and okay. Listen, I'm not saying that people must return a smile with a smile, but isn't it common decency to greet new neighbors nicely? I mean, that's what I do. I knocked on 3 houses on that day and decided that I was done with the meet and greet for the day. If you're curious, there was no one in the 3rd house. As the days passed, I noticed a series of odd things about the neighborhood. Firstly, there were no children within the gated community. There was one family with 2 teenage daughters. They are the Henderson family. Those 2 Henderson girls were the only people in town under the age of 30 as far as I was concerned. Everyone else looked to be in their late 30s to early 50s. And by the way, the Hendersons were the only normal people in town as far as my investigation was concerned up to that point. Talking to anyone else outside of the family was akin to attempting conversations with pebbles and rocks. Secondly, there were many more empty houses than I had expected. I walked around the neighborhood several times and my last count was 21 empty homes. I had a conversation about that with Mr. Henderson. He told me that when their family had moved here, that there were 3 other normal families within town. But they had since moved out and the Hendersons were planning to do the same pretty soon. Like me, they moved here because of the relative safety and privacy, but they had no idea what the people were like. About a month after moving there, for the first time aside from the Hendersons, I had a neighbor knock on my door. The individual was Mr. Bailey from 2 houses down. He gave me the creeps as soon as I opened the door. He had this unnatural smile on his face and invited me to join him and others in what he called neighborhood assembly. I told him I would be there and was about to shut the door, but Mr. Bailey continued to stand there with a fake smile on his face. He only left when I insisted that I had a chore to finish before joining him. That interaction was extremely creepy. I didn't know what type of meeting they were having, and thus I dressed up in semi-formal attire and left the house. Mr. Bailey said they were meeting up in the bowling alley. That's about 5 minutes of walk, and so I walked there. The meeting was already in progress by the time I got there. I managed to get inside the building without anyone noticing, and thank God for that because I knew right away I did not want to be there. Observing them interact with one another was like watching half-baked robots trying to have normal human conversation. I didn't stay for too long, but the conversation were about what they had done in the past months, the things they found joyful, and what more they wanted to do. Something along that line. In any event, I sneaked out of the bowling alley and went straight home after that. I should also mention that the Henderson were not in attendance. I had a talk with Mr. Henderson a couple of days thereafter. He too was invited in the past and still gets invited every month, but he never attended a single meeting since he found everyone in the neighborhood really creepy. The Hendersons moved out after a month. I did the same about 2 months thereafter when I finally managed to sell the house. I took a loss on the house, but I was more than happy to make the sacrifice. I was so ready to move on. I actually moved into another gated community after that. The second time, however, I did my due diligence to observe the people in the neighborhood as much as I checked the property itself. I'm glad to say that I still live in the same neighborhood and I've been loving it here from day one. As for the other gated community, they basically closed their doors to newcomers around 2010. The entire neighborhood was bought up by some people, I'm assuming the residents, and they had since turned it into a type of communal living facility. The community went from weird to completely nuts in less than a decade. I don't know much more about them, and that's probably a good thing. It's hard to say what the deal was with that town and its people, but people like them actually exist in this world, and if you think about it, that's kinda scary. I got a job as a security guard when I was 23 years old. This was in 2015, and it was not long after I had given up trying to find a decent job with my college degree. If you're curious, I gave up trying to find a job in my field because they were all offering less than $30K a year. The security job paid $17 an hour, so in a place called college, I had wasted 4 years of my life and tens of thousands of dollars in tuition for nothing. Because here's what I learned after graduation. Security jobs don't require a college degree. In any case, I worked nights and I was the lawn guard from the hours of 10 p.m. through 6 a.m. The building that I was guarding was a single-story structure, but it was long and wide, about the size of a football field. It was pretty massive. The building was very modern and high-tech. It seemed like every door had biometric locks installed on them. No doors had been locked, however, due to the operation having moved to a different location. So I basically worked there as a temp until new teams of scientists would be assigned to the building and they would need to hire professional security. My job there was simple. There was an automatic alarm system that would go off at different times depending on the day. So when it goes off, I'm supposed to sweep the entire building from one end to the other to make sure that I'm the only one in the building. I was quite scared for the first couple of weeks. If you could for a minute imagine yourself being alone in a building the size of a football field, and at night at that, not to mention the building was located far from the lights and noises of the city. It was eerily quiet there and I felt extremely isolated. That being said, I did not dare go into any rooms making the sweeps for the first couple of weeks. I was told to do so, to be thorough and to take my time, but I just didn't have it in me to enter those rooms. I'm a bit of a scary cat. Anyhow, everything was white and mostly made out of metal, those being the cabinets, chairs, desks, and other techy looking things that I didn't recognize. The aesthetics made it feel like I was in a morgue rather than a lab. It felt extremely spooky being in a place of such design and purpose. Even so, I did get used to things with time. I began inspecting the rooms from around week 3. The larger rooms, I needed a little more time to grow a set, but the smaller ones, I could enter them just fine by then. Then, about a month into the job, I finally entered one of the larger rooms, and of course nothing happened and I came out of it without getting attacked by a ghost or a monster. On the same night, when the alarm went off for the second time, I entered the largest room in the building. That room was kind of interesting because it still has some equipment and furniture inside. All the other rooms were fairly empty, with only desks and chairs being present, if at all. This room was a little more filled. I was proud of myself for finally growing a pair to enter their room. It would have been a fine night if that was the end of it, but I had the unfortunate luck of discovering a tiny notebook under a metal shelf. I should have never read its contents, but I did. I can't recall word for word, but I'll describe to you the contents of the notebook to the degree that I remember. The first thing that I have to mention is the basement level, a level that I didn't know existed up to that point. The notebook specifically mentioned patients and subjects' rooms in the basement level. The first subject was described as possessing exceptional strength. It wasn't natural, however, as it was also noted that the individual had been injected with some sort of a foreign substance. Extreme caution was specified when approaching the subject. One of the nurses had both of his arms broken like they were straws. The second subject was described as having put in a state of constant rage. It noted that the subject hadn't slept in over 80 hours and that he was reaching his limits. He too had been injected with some sort of foreign substance. This subject was altered as well. The third subject was a 40-year-old man who had been brainwashed into believing that he is a 5-year-old boy. It mentioned a combination of methods such as humiliation, hypnosis, injection of something, and some other techniques that I can't recall today. The fourth subject was a woman who had been given all kinds of diseases and survived. I recall the note mentioning malaria, bubonic plague, dengue virus, and a number of other diseases that I could no longer remember. She suffered little to no symptoms from all the diseases she was exposed to. The fifth subject was a man who had been administered many different types of concoctions of hallucinations. I won't name the concoctions by names, but I think I make it fairly obvious when I say the word hallucinations. But going back to the subject, it noted that the man could access information that he didn't have knowledge of before the administration, that he knew of things that had happened before his birth. Some of the things he knew were very obscure information that only a fraction of the population had knowledge of. The sixth subject was the last entry I read. There were more, but I just stopped reading at that point. But yeah, the sixth subject was a man who had gone through a brain transplant. They had transplanted the brain of a perfectly healthy and normal 25-year-old man to the body of a convicted criminal of multiple murders. It noted that the young man's brain could in fact access the memory of the criminal. The young man could recall the names of the criminal's families, victims, and even adopted many of the habits the body possessed when it was under the control of the original mind. I believe they were confirming that the body also remembers, that maybe our DNA can transfer our memories as well. In any event, I stopped reading the note right at that point. I also left it where I had found it and went through the rest of the shift as though I hadn't seen anything out of the norm. For days after the unwanted discovery, I pondered whether or not I should report it to the police or the FBI. That thought ended when I heard from the security guard who does the shift prior to mine say that a well-known politician had visited the site earlier in the day. He told me that many important-looking people were touring the building. The logic behind me staying quiet was this. Firstly, the people behind the experiments had the means to conduct such heinous acts without any repercussion. Secondly, whether in knowing or not of the purpose of the facility, a well-known politician was seen at the site. Thirdly, I'm just a temporary security guard who no one gives a damn about. The way I saw it, if I said anything about the experiments, I would be lucky if I ended up getting ridiculed. And in worst case scenario, my prognosis and outcome would be added on the note. I mean to say that I would against my will become a participant in their sick experiments, but only if I spoke out, of course. I'm not sorry for who I am today and where my place is in society. But by the same token, I also know that I don't matter in the grand scheme of things. That is to say, I could disappear tomorrow off the face of the earth and the world will go on without me like a well-oiled machine. I don't really matter. Recognizing that, I decided to keep my mouth shut and continue working there until I was no longer needed. You might be asking why I hadn't quit. Well, there was a reason behind it as well. I didn't think it would look good to quit so abruptly. It could possibly draw some unwanted attention. Probably not, but it was possible. I worked there for another 6 months until the facility was scheduled to be used by the next group of scientists. They actually offered me a permanent position for when the facility would be reopened, but I declined and moved on to something else. Last thing I'll mention is that the facility is no longer in existence. They demolished it in 2018, even though the building still must have been in a fairly new condition. I drive by that place on my way to work Monday through Friday, and even till this day, I still feel horrible whenever I drive past the site. I would move to somewhere else if I had the means, but I don't, and I have to stick around until I could get a job somewhere, preferably very far from here. I'm not saying that I'm in danger for being near the site. It's just that it's not good for the mind. I'll never feel comfortable until I'm far away from this place. That is all. I grew up in the countryside and never set foot outside of our town until the age of 20. You see, my sister got married when I was 19 and she had moved to the city not long after the wedding. I missed her a lot after not seeing her for about a year. So one day I decided I was going to pay her a visit and left my town for the first time in my life. When I went to her place, I was so content to see for myself how happy she looked. Her husband, who originates from our town as well, he was a thoughtful and devoted life partner. I couldn't possibly ask for more than that from a brother-in-law. I was really happy for both of them. 3 days passed so quickly. The plan was to stay there for 4 days, so basically I would leave on the 4th night. My sister and I were both really sad, especially because it was just me and her for a while there. We had a painful past. My dad passed away in an accident when he was in the military. I was only 9 years old when we lost him. And my mom, she died from cancer when I was 14 and my sister 18. We wouldn't have made it on our own if not for the strong bond we share as siblings. So yeah, I'm sure all siblings care deeply for one another, but because of the adversities we had to face together, our bond had to be that much stronger for us to continue living, striving, and doing all we could to make the best out of the opportunities at hand. But yeah, on the 3rd night of my stay there, my sister suggested that we should go to an amusement park the next day. She guaranteed that I would love it there, and not to mention it could possibly be my only chance to experience it for the foreseeable future. So I said yes and went to bed that night, all excited for the next day. The next morning, I was finally at the amusement park. And let me tell you, it was all that I had hoped for and then some. It made me feel like I had gone back to being a kid, and that led to lots of thoughts of my parents. But not the sad memories. I only thought of the happy ones. I was having a blast. We were going to finish the day with a ride that was supposed to be scary. You were supposed to ride in a pod that could accommodate 2 people each. The pod was open up top so you could see everything around you, and closed at the bottom, which I'm sure it was designed as such for safety reasons. Anyhow, the pods ran on rails, and it was a slow ride. The scare you're supposed to get on that ride was not the speed, but rather the point was to terrify the riders with the lights, animatronics, and the actors who play the parts of some of the monsters and ghosts. We waited on the line and I saw two girls in front of me get on board on one of the pods. Next in line was me, and then my sister and her husband would ride on the pod behind mine. The ride began to move, and right away I realized I had aged one too many years to be able to enjoy the ride fully. Still, it was amusing. Lights that resembled those at the clubs were flickering everywhere. There were some crude animatronics jumping out of coffins, walls, and the ground. Then there were the actors who were dressed in costumes, and they came so close to you that they could touch you if that was in the script. The pods moved along the rail, and then there was a stretch of the tunnel where everything got pitch black. I think the point was to scare people by touching them, because I could feel feathery materials rubbing against my arms and chest. I gotta admit, that was a bit creepy for sure. The darkness lasted maybe 7-8 seconds, then the lights began flickering again. That's when I noticed the girls who were in the pod ahead of mine had disappeared. Yeah, they were no longer in their pods. It took a few more bright flickers of light for me to be sure, but the pod was definitely empty. After I was sure what was happening, that's when I began to look behind me and not forward. I had to make sure that my sister was in her seat. I was reassured by the fact that my brother-in-law was with her, but just in case, I was ready to jump out of the pod in case anything happened to her. The ride lasted for only 30 seconds, but those 30 seconds felt more like 30 hours. In time, however, it came to a stop. As I got off at the stop, my sister's pod also arrived. She was safe and sound, and I could finally relax a little. Having established my sister's safety, I ran straight to one of the staffs and let him know of the two girls who had disappeared during the ride. The guy seemed to be in on it. He had to be, since he was acting as though there weren't any riders in the pod ahead of mine. He knew there was a lie because there was a long line of people who were waiting to go on that ride. There was absolutely no reason to send an empty pod into the tunnel. And yet, he stood there telling a lie with a straight face. A crowd began to form, and even though some people began to look at me like I was crazy, I didn't give up. If those girls were my sisters, and if a stranger was in my position, I wouldn't want that person to give up on my sisters either. So you know what? I could care less what people thought of me at the time. My sister was sure confused, and she kept asking me what was happening. I simply told her that I would explain things to her later. I didn't have any time to waste. A couple more staff members came over, and I demanded they turn off the ride. You see, the ride was designed to move continuously. You get off the ride as it slows down back at the starting point, and not when it comes to a stop, because it never does come to a stop. When the staff members refused to listen to me, I said fudge it and just ran into the tunnel. The tunnel was extremely disorienting due to all of the flickering lights. It took me a few minutes, but I finally found the area where the girls had been lost. There was another staff member right behind me holding a flashlight, but it wasn't the guy who pretended that everything was okay. It was another guy. I wasn't sure that I could trust him, but I didn't have much of a choice. I asked him if there was a door nearby, and his answer was a yes. He led me toward the door, and when I opened it, there was a small room without a door, and I could also see a long corridor leading to an exit far ahead. So I ran into the room, and then through the corridor, I saw a staircase going down to the basement while I was running towards the exit. I thought about going to the basement first, but I took my chances with the exit. When I reached the exit and opened the door, there was nothing. It only led to one of the pathways at the amusement park. I quickly turned around and went to the staircase. All the while, the staff member was right behind me. I went downstairs and began opening every door I could find until I came across one that was locked. The staff member opened it with a key, and the girls, they were inside. They were unconscious, likely given some sort of sedative, but they were okay. The staff member radioed the park security, And as I was stepping out of the room where the girls were at, I made eye contact with another man who turned the corner at the far end of the corridor in the basement. It took a couple of seconds for both of us to react, but we basically ran at the same time. The man ran away from me and I ran towards him. As I was giving chase, I heard the staff member follow a bit behind as they radioed the park security to tell them where we were headed to and that we were chasing after the suspect. Not long after, we took another staircase and reached the ground level. I continued to give chase, the staff member continued to update the security, then I saw multiple security guards from different directions converge on the suspect. In less than a minute, the suspect was under a pile of very angry men, including me. The security caught 3 additional suspects on that day. One of the suspects was the staff member who lied to me about the pod in front of mine being empty. As it turned out, the staff member and 3 of his friends were planning to abduct young girls from the park. The buyers were already lined up as well. That part was discovered by the police. In the end, I was personally thanked by a local politician and as well as the head honcho of the police. I got requests to do interviews and some outlets wanted to take my photos, but I declined them all. I was just happy that the girls were safe and didn't care much about my 15 minutes of fame. Looking back, I think I was able to act brave and proactive because my sister was there. Right after I saw those girls disappear in the tunnel, all I could think of was the safety of my sister. However, once I established that my sister was safe and sound, then those 2 girls became my sisters. They became my responsibility. I know for certain that I couldn't have felt as connected to those girls if not for my sister being present right there and then. I got to meet the girls a few days later because they wanted to thank me. But again, much of what happened was thanks to my sister being there and their presence alone prompting me to act braver than usual. And yeah, I ended up staying at my sister's for a few days longer. The police wanted me there for a while, and the families of the girls reached out to me through the police as well. They wanted to treat me for dinner, and so I obliged. At the end of it all, everyone was safe, we were all happy, I went back home, and life's gone back to being normal and boring again, just the way I like it.